Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much, and for everyone that's going to listen to me in the next half an hour, 40 minutes. Good to see Dundalk's pitch there being used by STATSports. I have fond memories of getting sent off there, but that's a completely different story altogether. So I suppose I'll start with just a very short intro about myself, but some of the places I've been and worked at. Top left, you'll see Exeter City there. I believe was probably the first day of pre-season. I think I'm probably a little bit more tired than the players in that. Actually, the first day of pre-season was my first day, so it was pretty hectic. In the middle, some testing in the University of Greenwich there with Charlton Athletic, where I really just assisted with the gym work, but was kind of my first introduction on the sports science side into professional football. Even though I'd played quite a high standard in the UK and Ireland, I was never really on the sports science side. I was more on the technical side. Top right, Utah Royals, debriefing after a training session, pretty hot out here in the summer. Down at the bottom there, a presentation I was doing during my 3 years at Celtic, predominantly working with the women, but had some other roles there as well. Probably one of the most successful times in the club's history. So it was an incredible time to be there, and very fortunate to see the work of Ronnie Dyler and Brendan Rodgers during my time there. And just down in the bottom there, some consultancy work that I've done in the past. That was actually over in Ireland, working with the now West Ham assistant manager, Alan Irvine. So I suppose it's always good to start with what are the demands of football, of soccer. We know that they're quite complex physiologically. There's a lot going on. It's cyclic in nature, the sport. We need a really large toolbox of those qualities of aerobic, anaerobic, strength, power, speed, changes of direction. Those need to be in someone's toolbox to be successful. The demands can vary. It just really depends on the playing style, the position, the tactics, the opposition, and it's incredibly contextual, and we'll touch on that later. An estimate there, probably 200 to 300 training sessions, 40 to 70. I do remember Celtic playing about 75 in one season. They get a very short off seasons due to the Champions League qualifying. I think it was only themselves and Man United who were higher, who had played in the Europa League final that year. So players really need to be quite robust and resilient, and also that have that technical, tactical knowledge. So if we look at the actual relative contribution of physical performance, we know that high intensity running may vary by up to 30%, but it's actually irrespective of a match outcome. And that can go with total distance as well, that running further doesn't guarantee winning a game, and neither does high amounts of high intensity running. Losing teams often run more on the right-hand side there, and running performance actually influenced by, again, the status of the match. So a team could go down to 9 men or 8 men, and that's going to change those outputs dramatically. I have seen it when a team has had 11 on the park and the other team have had 10, and actually the team with 11 had higher outputs. So it's sometimes a little bit foolish to look at it and think just because a team's got one less, that you're going to do less and the other team's going to do more. It can change game to game. Being fit has really clear advantages. I think when we talk about fitness, we need to be able to carry out the technical, tactical demands and those short intermittent bursts adequately and successfully. But again, being fitter and faster doesn't actually guarantee success. But if you're not fitter and faster, it could be a problem. And again, that comes back really to being able to carry out the demands technically and tactically, but be able to perform those really intense periods or really intense spells in a game. Players should really be able to cope with the game demands and to execute those tactical roles efficiently to fit in with the head coach's game model. So I think when we look at different game models of coaches, and for an example, a high pressing game compared to a possession game can be completely different. Is a coach playing a 4-4-2, a 4-3-3, a 5-3-2? 4-2-3-1, all these different wonderful ones now. That's really going to affect the physical capacities that are required to play that system. Again, it is a technical, tactical sport. And I've just touched on there a little bit, that high intensity, high pressing, fast counter-attacking will be more metabolically demanding than a possession-based game. Martin Boucher also, some of the stuff, I really like his work that he's done, and some of the stuff he said there, I think we really know that we need to keep them fit and healthy, but we need to achieve this through the maintenance of stable and constant stimulus. And that's very, very important. If that stimulus drops off, then we could see players potentially not performing or struggling to get through games or carry out those technical and tactical demands. This comes from Paul Larsson's and Martin Boucher's work. And what this is showing you is you have someone at the top there. So they're poorly conditioned. So they're really struggling with the skill quality and effort intensity and carrying out those technical and tactical demands. Go down a little bit further. You've got they've got some fitness overall, but they're really lacking that football specific fitness. So we would probably say they're fit. I think when that question comes up, my answer is always, well, how fit is fit? Because it's contextual. But if your overall fitness is okay, but you're lacking that football specific fitness, then the effort intensities and that skill quality may go down. And actually, if you look at the bottom, Sergio Aguero down there, he's pretty fit to compete. He can carry out those demands. Maybe a little drop off there to the left of that skill and intensity, but generally consistent throughout the game. And I think that's what top level players are when we consider fitness. So on a day-to-day basis, we probably collect a lot of data, STATSports for our GPS. We have access to other tools, but this is just a generalization of what some players may be asked to submit on a daily basis, which is an awful lot. I think Professor Barry Dross wrote about this last year. That could be up to 80 touch points with a player, which is an awful lot. And these days, things tend to be submitted through apps and other means, iPads. But there's nothing wrong with the old pen and paper approach at times. So what we're saying here is during a player's working day, they may be submitting an awful lot of data. That's a lot of information, but how we connecting those dots and using that knowledge to try and understand what's going on with the player and how they're responding and how they're performing within their training and their match demands. So that gives us a bit of a performance puzzle. So we've got all these different demands depending on the player, their physical characteristics, their physiological capabilities, and also the technical, tactical demands. So this gives us a little bit of a puzzle to try and fix. So we'll start with periodization. My fascination, maybe, shall I say, with periodization goes back to probably my time at Celtic when Brendan Rodgers came in, and he used very much a sort of adapted tactical periodization model. And a few times I was lucky to sit with his staff and really discuss the sort of maybe the nuances in different kinds of models and how they were those models, in different clubs and basically his theory on it and our theory on it. Now he learned a lot from Jose Mourinho in that tactical periodization model, but having worked at a couple of different clubs, I've been really, really lucky to be exposed to different ways. I don't think any way is right or wrong, but I do think there's more to be considered than the physical side, and that's the basis of this presentation. So when we talk about periodization, it's really just the manipulation of a training stress to produce a desired outcome for competitive success. Now, we know that on a day, there's not just one training stress. That's quite a simplistic model, and it probably comes from Selye's work back in the 50s of applying that stress and then getting a response, a stress response. I think the original pillars of periodization really began to be looked at or began to emerge in Greece and Rome in the ancient Olympics and the games that they had there. But it wasn't until the 20th century that it began to really appear in the literature, around about 1902. Picala in 1913, I think it was Coton and Grattan in 1916 and 1936 respectively. They started to talk about this introduction of a phasic approach to training. And in 1922, I think it was Governor Linsky, produced a book called The Basis of Sport Training. I don't think you can get it on Amazon, but that was probably one of the first texts to come out on that basis of sports training and that systemic planning of training. I think the modern origins came out of the Eastern Bloc. Matayev, he started to write about it in 1981, and of course we have other people who have gone on and developed like Verkhoshansky and Tudor Bompa, amongst many others. I think when we talk about periodization, we need to understand that dose response and how that affects our preparation in a game. So applying that stimulus, what response are we getting from it? If we get that wrong, we could see poor performance, but we could also see maladaptation, which is probably a more concerning. I also think equal to that is if the stimulus isn't enough, then we start to see undertraining, which my personal philosophy is that undertraining is a lot more risky than overtraining for a variety of reasons. So there are some traditional periodization models, touched on in there, Matayev. I won't go into these into too much detail, but these started to appear around about the 80s. Again, we've got different types there. We've got the systemic load and load recovery blocks. We've got that pendulum, and also the high load models. Now, these were heavily based on Eastern European weightlifting in a singular sport and not as a team sport, which is quite interesting because some of them may still be adopted into team sports. Then we started to see some contemporary periodization models. These, we've got Verkhoshansky's in those training blocks, so it's more intense specific training. And we've got the Bondarchuk method, Bompa as well. I think one time I was pretty bored and I sat and read all of Bompa's text, which took me a weekend. But then we've got sort of the more specific in football. So Cerullo worked with Johan Cruyff at Barcelona, and he started to talk about that cognitive model. Now, I would anecdotally start to think that was possibly the beginning of the popular or popularized tactical periodization model. Raymond Verheijen's had an input into that as well with his 6-week model. And then probably more prominent these days, and one that people have started to look at a little bit more, is Vitor Frade's tactical periodization, which probably blew a lot of the conventional methods out of the water. So most periodization models, again, this is a generalization, will be split into those phasic training blocks, where you will have your annual plan, your preparatory periods, and then your transition being the off season. It doesn't always look like this, but generally there will be some form of annual plan. Now in football or soccer, probably the only time we can truly periodize is that pre-season period, which would be the general and specific preparation periods. They can also be used in the off season, but I think that's a different story altogether. And then we get into that very, very long competitive phase, which makes it unique compared to the sort of your weightlifting and the individual sports and possibly the Olympic sports as well, because we have a long competitive, a small off season, and a relatively small preparatory phase. So the thing with periodization and using and looking at those models in that sort of entity is it's really just a map of where we're going. But any map is not reality. It's just a reduction of what they actually represent. So looking at a map on a scale is completely different to the actual reality of the situation or your landscape. So we look at those periodization models as a map, but it doesn't really give us a representation of what's going on. So anybody that's seen Zoolander, this is quite a famous scene where he's building a school, he's introduced to the school, and he decides it's a centre for ants, because looking at that model, he's made an assumption that that is the reality, but actually it's a lot different. So, that's understanding a model literally, a rigid model, which some periodization models may be, but there's a lot more to it, and there's a huge reality into why someone is responding or maybe not responding to training. So there's been some critiques of periodization, and this presentation is not to critique different periodization models. I think I've done that in the last couple of presentations that I've given. It's not really about that. But I think it's worth noting that if we look at the work that Afonso did recently, 92.5% of studies focused on physical in periodization, but 52% of those were strength. 14% were strength and endurance, 2.4% were power, another 2.4% was power and speed. Only 2 papers actually were greater than 24 weeks, which is 4.8% of the ones that they reviewed in that paper. There's actually no paper that goes longer than 9 months, which makes you think, when you think of a competitor of a long football season, and the basis of periodization in that dose response and adaptation. So there's very little empirical evidence, and John Kiley's done some critiques of periodization. Again, I would recommend reading those papers. There's very little empirical evidence to back them up. So if we think of fitness, and I'll use that as a general term, think of fitness adaptations. Well, they should be subsequent to the training stresses. But those training stresses are pretty much influenced by the neuro and biochemical factors, the stress that's being applied. So he's done some really good work on that, and I would definitely recommend reading them. As I say, I'm not here to critique periodization models as such, so we'll move on. So again, if we do look at models anyway, the dictionary definition will tell you that a model is a representation, generally in miniature, to show you the construction of appearance of something, or a simplified description. So it's a system and a process to help you or to guide you in your calculations and predictions. And I think that's important when we talk about periodization. I think we can become compartmentalized at times and be adamant that one model may be better than the other. There's certainly been some arguments in that recently, mainly on social media, but I think it's foolish to just try and compartmentalize things and say that one is better than the other, because I think the head coach's philosophy, the playing style, these are all huge factors into the periodization model that someone would like to apply. So if we just really briefly look over this, thank you to Tom Little for this slide, but there's a couple of different maybe common models there. So your tactical periodization, the new kid on the block there, an adapted tactical model, the British model, Sunday, Wednesday off, and then Raymond Verheijen's sort of microcycle model there. Again, I'm not going to critique those, but central to those for us is our GPS and our heart rate and other metrics that we collect, so that we can try and understand the volumes and loads of our athletes and what they can tolerate and what their match demands are. And I think that's incredibly important. Again, these are only taken on a Saturday to Saturday, or you could say Sunday to Sunday. The reality is we may have to play games in quick succession, and especially with the environment that we're now in, that looks more probable. So if we take that and strip that down into maybe a week, I think the essence of those models is still the same. We recover for a couple of days, we load, and then we taper. I think they're all pretty similar in that way, that they all kind of have those principles within that week. And that's really about managing fatigue. So it's all for that preparation for the match day. When we start to look at that again, this is from Gary Walker and Richard Hawkins over at Man United when they were there, and this is the work that they did. Another paper I would recommend reading. So if we look at that, very much taken off a kind of tactical periodization model, where we have that day off, then we have a kind of football-based recovery, intensive football, those small spaces, open it out, and then we've got speed and power, and then reactivity in a game. So I think that's worth looking at as acquisition and tapering periods. So again, they're pretty much the same, where we recover, we load a little bit, and then we taper off. One of the things, the Verve are one of my favourite bands, by the way, but one of the things when I was talking to some of the coaches at Celtic about periodization and mainly their tactical periodization model and how they were using that, was the manipulation of space and time. It's a great song if you haven't heard it. It's actually a classic album as well. But I think if we think of that and manipulating space and time, when we're planning those weekly microcycles, I don't think we're going to go too far wrong. If you go into smaller spaces, which our GPS will tell us, you're going to get higher axials, decels, changes directions, probably of a greater magnitude, shall I say. And then when you open it up, you're going to get a lot more high-speed running, potentially a lot more total distance. So the manipulation of space and time is very, very important when we're looking within that weekly physical microcycle. So then this is sort of a tactical periodization model. And as you can see along the bottom, you've got those spaces there that are changing on a day-to-day basis, again, to manipulate space and time and different physical targets within that. So as you see, the strength day there, which is your smaller spaces, you've got higher axial decels, where you have the endurance, you're going to get higher total distance, high speed running. Speed is at max velocity, and reaction could be just match breadth. I think that's a good way. I'll stress that tactical periodization is more about the principles and sub-principles as it is a physical model. So the emphasis of tactical periodization is getting everything through the game and not isolating things not isolating physical qualities. Some of that I'm maybe not as assured on. I think there are times that we need to isolate physical qualities if we're looking to overload certain parameters. So, for instance, high-speed running, are we getting it out of that drill? I think you can design them the best you can, but then maybe times then we have to, as physical preparation coaches or sports scientists, we may have to keep that player going for their match demands. I remember a player who had about 600 meters of high-speed running was about his threshold for a game, and another player that would be around about that 1,500 meters of high intensity running, shall I say. Now, if you just give those two players the same training dose, it may be adequate for one and not the other, but it may not be adequate for either. So I think that's where we get down to the nitty gritty of individualizing based on those physical demands and outputs and what the game demands are of that playing model, your system of play and the individual characteristics of that player. So I think there are questions around tactical periodization. I don't think there's empirical data to back up some of these things, but it's becoming more and more popular, and understandably so. As I say, those terms there, strength, endurance, speed, reaction, I actually really like. I think it explains to coaches what you're looking for physically within those sessions. But tactical periodization per se is not based on those. So this is something, it's probably not the easiest to see there. I couldn't fit it all onto one slide. But this is something that we created, taken from various different papers, to explain to coaches that when we do these small-sided, medium-sided, long-sided games or large-sided games, whatever you want to call them, we're looking at certain things. So you can target primary physiological adaptation through those games based on your sets and reps. I remember the assistant manager at Celtic had a sports science degree, and I asked him, how do you feel that's helped your coaching career? And he just said, well, it hasn't. And I was like, interesting, because it doesn't really do sports scientists much good. But what he did say to me, and I thought was a really good takeaway point from that conversation, was it helps me understand how to manipulate sets and reps and how important that is. What we've added into this, say this came from a few different papers and from experience, but we've looked at the technical actions maybe of those games, and then classified those as high, medium, or low. So the coaches tend to know that if they're going to play a certain game, so we may go into a 3v3, we're going to get high passing, high receiving, dribbling, turn, but you're going to get low headers, which is probably self-explanatory. You're going to risk high tackles, low blocks, intercept, high shots. But I think that visualizes it for coaches. So when we're planning things, we're able to say, okay, this is what we need out of it physically, and what they may need technically as well. So I think it just helps form with part of a process of where we're going and what the physical outputs that we will be looking for. We could build that around their philosophy and their training methods. The training process. So I think really when we start to think of load, it's really just the work carried out by a player. I don't know why at times we try to make that so complex. Load can be separated into two categories. So we've got the external load there, which represents the training work by players. So we would look at high-speed running, total distance, meters per minute, etc. And that's independent of the individual characteristics on the left. This comes from Franco and Pellizzeri's work and Aaron Coutts. And then we have that internal training load, which is relative to the person. So the physiological and psychological stress on the player. So we can use heart rate indices for those, RPE, blood lactate, creatine kinase. Probably the last two, they're a little bit more invasive and not commonly used. But that internal load is important to us. So while the external load gives us the indicator of the work completed or planning for that work required, and the capabilities and capacities of the player, the internal load actually gives us that dose or that response to the player, how that player is responding to training. I think that's very, very important, because ultimately we want to know how the player is responding to training. If we look at the fundamentals of periodization, and as I said earlier, maybe a little bit compartmentalized, but if we look at that dose response and adaptation, then it's important we understand the internal load. This is something that I created from Van ter Heijm's work in 2017, and how we can look at those different things. So we've got the physiological to the left, the biomechanical, and actually what happens if we fail. So undertrain, and then if we overload, a failure to do that, or underload, and what that homeostatic state should be. And the different measures that we can get from that, mainly from our GPS. So I think it's important to understand these things, the internal and external load measures, and how we can try and quantify those and form a bigger picture of how that player is responding. So I think, again, when we talk about load, we really need to understand that there's very individual responses. We spoke there about the characteristics of someone, genetics and previous training history just being two, and how they are going to respond. Probably most important on this slide, or on this infographic, is the phase of the season and their accumulative load across the season. I think they're going to have a huge influence. So here at the Rio Tinto Stadium in Salt Lake City, we actually have a couple of problems or challenges, shall I say, which really influence, or should influence, or maybe, well, they do influence our periodization on a weekly basis. And that is that we play at altitude of 1,400 meters, and also heat. So if we look at the acute impact of heat and hypoxic environments, there's an awful lot going on within an individual. So that, for example, the raise in heart rate, the greater discomfort and RPE that player will give you, that will increase the internal-external load ratio when we look at that as well. So there's certain things that we need to factor in, because it could be foolish to just look at a report and draw inferences from it without actually considering the fact of altitude and heat as part of that. So as you can see in the bottom right there, it does get very hot here in those summer months. We're waiting for it to heat up at the moment. Conversely, in the winter, we get a lot of snow. So it's an interesting environment, being so high as well, that the actual the strength of the sun is incredibly strong. You can feel it. So these are all things we need to factor in or be cognizant of in a weekly or daily session, the heat and the hypoxia. It's worth noting there isn't much humidity here. So as I said earlier, when it's hot, it's hot. Previously, we've gone away to places on the East Coast. It's hot, but there's a really high humidity. So again, that's going to change the potentially the dose response that we get out of training. So if we start to look at nutrition, do those nutritional demands adequately fit the weekly demands, the weekly physical demands of a player? Does the player actually understand these demands? And can we periodize that? How can we periodize somebody's nutrition within a week? I don't think it's a new concept, fueling for the demands of your work. But I think when we look at it, athletes need to so one of the most common things recently is sort of low carbohydrate, high fat diets, but actually carbohydrate supports performance. It's been given a bad name through a variety of channels, but actually within a working week, athletes probably need to be somewhere in the middle and fuel for the demands of the work, because not every training day is the same. We know that fat oxidation will yield more energy, but it's not as quick as carbohydrates. So it is in an intermittent sport, it's likely to, or it is their main source of fuel. That leads to some periodization of carbohydrate, and there's some evidence to support that carbohydrate restriction will augment, aerobic training. So that's interesting about how we're going to periodize that as well. Restricting carbohydrate is not particularly optimal for players, and reducing at certain times in a periodized week could be beneficial for health, body composition and performance. We kind of have this paradigm here of fit but unhealthy. So we've got a training and eating paradigm here. This is from the work of Philip Maffetoni and Paul Larson here. What we're saying is that, they define fitness as the quantity of human performance, of, the physical ability to compete at their athletic potential. So that would be fitness. But health is slightly different. They're two different things. So you've got the physical, the biochemical, the mental well-being, in which the systems, the bodily systems such as neuromuscular, metabolic, digestive, immune, hormonal, all function in harmony. So fit and healthy are two different things. What they were saying here is that, you can be fit, but you can also be unhealthy. And that can be a problem, because we need to make sure that our athletes are fit and healthy to perform. Too much poor food, poorly processed or heavily processed food could possibly contribute to inflammation through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA, which is the primary link between the nervous and endocrine systems, and also helps to regulate the regulation of stress response. So I think it's important with the nutrition is one of those areas within a periodized week that we need to look at. This actually comes from a player I worked with a few years ago. As you can see, this is actually only one day. I like to think we educated them, and I'll show you how in a minute. But this was taken through Nutritic software. And as you can see, the calories on the top there consumed by the player were pretty low. Whether there was a reporting in that, I'm not sure, but it's still going to be quite low for those demands. So when we look at it from the left on the bottom there, if we look at those little charts, you can see that he starts to feel low energy, an increase in soreness, and then we've got the final day there. So that's probably not what we want to see in a training week when you've got to perform at a weekend. So if we look at the British week of loading, as I said, I'm just going to touch on a couple of different periodization models, but we can see the higher outputs in those green there, and then where we can potentially manipulate carbohydrates for those players. So the yellow being slightly lower maybe, and then the red where the areas that we could manipulate based on that player. What we found, some analysis that we did with other players, is we found that they tend to eat every day like it was a match day. So that took a lot of education within the players to say, we need to be changing this slightly. What we use for that, we use Tom's Colour Fit, which I think, if you haven't come across it, is an excellent tool. We're really, really lucky here at the Utah Royals that we have a nutritionist who I like to spend a lot of time with and consult to when we have nutritional issues. But we agree that, you know, the periodization on the physical side, but the nutritional side is also incredibly important. So again, you know, when we talk of periodization, it is more than physical. So this is a typical sort of European week. You could call it tactical if you want. And the same thing again. So when are we going to manipulate carbohydrate intake for the players, with your match being the highest? That sort of tactical periodization model, match day -4, match day -3 tend to be your highest loading days. And again, an example of a Saturday to Saturday from ColourFit and how they would break that down based on the training demands. But as I said, we're really, really lucky to have a full-time nutritionist here. So it's great to work with them and get those views on fueling for the demands required by players. But as I say, ColourFit is an incredible resource, and we used that previously with the chart that I showed the player, and educated a little bit more on how those demands in training and how you need to fuel for those. So recovery, another sort of area that we've looked at there, or another part of that puzzle for me. So in that periodization or that performance puzzle, recovery is part of that. So how do we know when our players are ready to perform? Because we often think, and this comes from some of Robin Thorpe's work, formerly at Man United, now down at Altis, and a good friend of mine. We often think of recovery and fatigue as a single thing, but actually there's quite a few different sources, as this slide illustrates, that will influence maybe the intervention that you're going to use. I think it's documented there's a lot of recovery, and I use that in inverted commas, interventions that may be not particularly evidence-based or pretty useless to some extent. And that kind of ties in with nutritional as well, because I think nutrition can be a bit of a minefield as well, because there's a lot of confusing information that's out there. I think when we look at recovery, what happens is somebody's reporting tired potentially from a game, and we just throw the kitchen sink out of it. And this is one of Robbie's analogies. I think that's quite true. Let's just try everything. But in reality, maybe we should be looking to periodize that. So if we look at some of the strategies of recovery, cold water immersion, you know, that may influence our acute and chronic training activations, and in manipulating those variables at the right time may influence the right outcomes. So I think a lot of this comes down to education and the data that you're collecting. Again, we need to look at the source of fatigue. Is it neuromuscular? Is it metabolic? We know, you know, after a match, we want to reduce inflammation within the muscles. I think when we start to look in that week, you know, cold water immersion and restricting blood flow may be where we need to go with that. And then gradually, increasing blood flow as we go on. So getting rid of that metabolic waste and removing those products. But I think from there, from our GPS data, that's where we start to monitor load and obviously everything else we collect on the internal side to try and understand that individual. You know, everybody is different in the way they respond. Why is that player possibly more hasn't recovered as quickly? What is that, and what is the source of that fatigue, shall we say? Is it mechanical stress? Was there a high amount of high-speed running? We know that, you know, high-speed running or some recent research over 5.5 meters per second is probably the most sensitive to fatigue or external internal load variables. I think, you know, we throw the kitchen sink at it. I'll just, you know, go and foam roll and things like that. Go and do that, when actually we should probably be looking to restrict blood flow first and then increase it. There's different strategies to do that, but I think it takes time to understand what works for somebody. So using a jump test, well, we may be using that for neuromuscular fatigue. So it's an area that should also be periodized depending on that individual's. I think the modalities have to really fit the person and not the person fit the modality. Which is an interesting point, because sometimes someone will tell you, "Oh, I like that," and I do believe that, you know, there is an element of that, a placebo effect. But I think we also need to determine, is it actually recovering someone from the stress that's been imposed. Psychological periodization, I'm not a psychologist, but I think it's an area that's becoming a little bit more prominent. I think a lot of this is taken from the tactical periodization, and I'll move into that in a minute. But how can we work within that, within a week or a training block, to understand the demands on a player cognitively? I think we look at it and say, that psychological skills, there's central areas of performance. We know that, but there's very, very little research in psychological periodization, especially for something as complex as soccer and team sports. In fact, it's practically non-existent in soccer. I think it's quite complex in team sports. We've long seasons, weekly, bi-weekly games, travel, small preparation phases. We tend to work in microcycles. I think there was research in periodization. I think it was Bacon in 1989 that started to look at that, and some stuff that came out around 2000 from Balag, and that periodization of more mental skills. This is something, again, that comes from tactical periodization, which is that sort of holistic, fully integrated model. The principle of fatigue and concentration came about from Friday's work in 2004. And what he said, that tactical fatigue relates to a player's capacity to focus on the actions, and then that the actions that characterize the team's style of play. So everything in tactical periodization is focused around the principles and sub-principles of 4 phases of play, and very much how much information is a player being given, and that tactical load. I think a heavy tactical load could lead to a heavy mental fatigue. If you're taking in a lot of instructions at work on the day and in a normal job, then you are going to feel tired afterwards. And I think it's the same with players. The amount of information, when are they taking it in? When do we periodize that in a week? What do we give them within a week? But it's a relatively unexplored area. So a lot of this comes from, there's no empirical research to back this up. And actually neither is there for tactical periodization methodology. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider it as part of, one of our cornerstones of periodization. So when we look at it like that, is periodization actually more than physical? So we've touched on these areas here. So we've got nutritional, recoveries, physical, physiological as well, and psychological. The physical side that we looked at, some of these periodization models that we've seen are traditionally from a single sport. Does that mean they're are they effective? It's been very, very hard. As I said, there's no studies over 9 months. No empirical data has actually attempted to make the predictions of adaptation within periodization. Do we really need to rethink this? I think tactical periodization has maybe made people think, and I'm not advocating that model over another. Again, it's heavily dependent on your head coach and the playing style and the philosophy of those things. So I think it's a very rounded model, but I also think it's been misinterpreted at times and taken out of context. Just adding terms like strength, endurance, speed, reactions doesn't mean it's a tactical periodization model, because funny enough, you need that tactical element and the principles and sub-principles. I think, with nutrition, I think education, and hopefully I've given you an example of that, could be the key factor. Do the players understand those demands within a weekly cycle? If you've got 2 games, if you have 1 game, do they know about changing their nutrition based on the demands of their training? And it's very important that, if you're working with a nutritionist or a player, they understand what's the heavier and lighter days. Recovery, there's a lot of different strategies out there. There's different efficacy in those. Some good, maybe some are not doing so much good. But I think periodization is incredibly important here as well. And I hope that slide there within that model, that framework of possibly what a week should look like, is a small example of that periodization. Psychological, I think this area is going to emerge. I think it's very hard to quantify. That's a personal opinion. But I think we potentially could study how mental fatigue throughout a training week. And that comes down to the amount of instructions. How much is a player taking in? If it's game day -1, have they spent the whole day just being bombarded with instructions, or is that coming through the week? And I think tactical periodization touches on that as well. So that's that performance puzzle. We've got the physical, the nutritional, the psychological, and the recovery areas. There are other areas. We've spoken here about tactical, technical and tactical, and the influence that has, the styles of play. But these are 4 areas that I think we may be able to periodize, and that for me makes it greater than just the physical side, which sometimes we get compartmentalized and just seem to look at that physical side when there's an awful lot going on within a player's months, weekdays of a season and training. So if we take this from the work of Majika and Howson in 2018, they made some suggestions on how to periodize these different areas, which I thought was really interesting. So again, at the start there, we said that generally some form of periodized model maybe will be split into compartments: general, specific, competition, and off-season, or your transition, as that's sometimes known. So within those times, what are we looking to achieve, and where are we going with that? This is just an overview of how those areas could be periodized. When we look at nutrition, that's another area again that we hopefully in this presentation, I feel that that's an area we can work harder on periodizing. Just smashing loads of food every day is probably not going to do someone's body composition great, especially a high level athlete. But I think a lot of that comes from education. Can we improve their body composition? What's their pre-match, intra-match? What's their post-match recovery like? Travel, hotels. How can we influence that with nutrition? Does the player understand what they should be in match day -1 as opposed to match day +1? Can we work with them on those nutritional goals? The off season, what are we looking for those players? Have we got other goals that they need that we can identify and work with them? Mainly that will be done remotely, because players are often away for a period of time, especially in the NWSL, where there's a long off season. So there's a real window of opportunity to periodize and work back from the outcome. Recovery, again, another area I think that, as we said, some people just tend to throw the kitchen sink at it, and it's just a case of do this generically, when actually there's other things to it. And we need to get down to the nitty-gritty and understand how our players are recovering, which are, our GPS data and internal load data that we collect is influential on how we do this, and where we put this in maybe within a week. So do we look at using cold water immersion at the start of the week, and then maybe compression garments at the end of the week as we get closer to a game? Are we looking at, do we remove some of the maybe the cold water, because it has been shown to decrease adaptations? Cold water immersion might be best avoided after resistance training, so not uncommon to do double sessions in that GPP, that pre-season. So if we remove some of those things, are we enhancing adaptation? I think that's an area that is influenced by culture, but I think it comes down to education to the player. I don't think removing things completely is maybe the best way, for many cultural reasons, but I think education there and understanding that we could start to bring that in the next phase, where we have pre-season games and we need to get them recovered a little bit quickly as we enter that competition phase. Psychological, as I've said, it could be a developing area, could be the missing area in the puzzle, but there's certain things that we can put within that week. Again, I would recommend reading Majika's paper and that periodization of strategies within team sports. It brings up some excellent points. Again, not a lot of research in the psychological side, but I think it really is an area that we could look at. And I think for me, how much information is that player taking in within a week without frying their brain? So I suppose as we come towards the end of this, I think hopefully what I've given you is that sort of being able to look back a little bit and or look out a little bit at that big world picture. I think if we tend to work in silos a little bit, or if we do, we end up just going down a complete rabbit hole. I think there's huge complexities in team sports, but also in individuals as well. And we really need to understand those. So looking at things from a bigger perspective or that bigger world picture, as opposed to just going down rabbit holes. It's very easy to just look at something and make an assumption based on physical data when actually there's an awful lot more going on. So really, just to wrap up, I think some of the points hopefully I've got across is that, you know, it is a technical tactical sport. The physical side and everything else should complement that. Playing styles, things, contextual factors within a game, tactical setups will all influence the model that you as a practitioner you may use or discuss. But ultimately, the head coach's philosophy is going to dictate that. I've been lucky that I've worked across a few different philosophies where coaches have different models, and that kind of opened my eyes a little bit more. I think we need that sort of holistic approach. I think tactical periodization is probably the most holistic. It's the only periodization program I'm aware of that's specifically based on soccer only. Although I will say I'm not sure it's been correctly translated and has sometimes led to different versions of it. I think it takes a lot of understanding. I think periodization, planning, and variation are all completely different concepts, and it's ultimately to determine which one you're using. So planning, training, and the variation of training are different to periodization models. Hopefully I've touched on that a little bit more, that, you know, they do come from can be very abstract from single sports. I think we have to question everything. I think we have to sort of really get our thinking cap on when we're looking at things from that bigger world perspective and try and understand why things are happening. That the data is great for that. What the data allows us to do, it's not going to allow us to answer those questions, but it will allow us to ask better questions of an individual, of a team, and how we're looking at that from a bigger perspective. I think it's incredibly important that we understand each individual athlete. Some will recover quickly, some won't. And these are the individual variations, shall we say, of working in a team sport. It's not just a one size fits all. So it's really a question of delving into our data, and how STATSports helps us with that, and the other data we collect is we're able to look at things maybe from a different perspective. Two people can have a completely different response to the same stimulus. So I think I use an example, a player at 600 meters and 1500 meters. So I think it's really on us to educate and facilitate and support coaches, understand that manipulation of space and time, and be able to show a sort of bigger picture on why people are not performing. It's very easy to point the finger and say, they've done too much in when actually there's probably an awful lot more going on. And that's it from me. If you've got any questions, you'll find me on Twitter, or you can email me. Thank you to STATSports for actually all the support that you give us. I think STATSports are brilliant with the work they do with us, and they're always there at the end of the phone when we need them. So thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much, man. I think you hit the nail on the head in the terms of just, a lot of times as practitioners, coaches, we get obsessive over the model, before the season arises. And, it's great to be reminded that sports brings about, constant change, and those individual things, that influence that load warrant a change. And I like that quote that you had right at the end. Sometimes if the only tool we have is a hammer, we treat everything as a nail, which is, of course, not the case. So great presentation. Really appreciate that. With that being said, kind of leading into the first question, which is, what are some main differences like inside of a seasonal microcycle for you all at Utah when you're looking at a home game to a home game versus an away game to an away game? Because obviously there's quite a lot of travel in NWSL, and it's all over the country, which can be quite vast.
Yeah, it's an interesting question and a good question. It's something maybe that I wasn't used to before I came here, because every game is a flight away. I think we're unique in the NWSL that the MLS plays in the conferences, whereas we actually play across the country, which brings a lot of complexity to it, a lot of travel. We are where we're located. I think probably Portland are the closest to us, but that's still a flight. So when we look at that, it depends on how we can adapt. What are the travel days? Are we actually going to travel when we get there? We may train before we travel. So these questions have to be addressed at how we're going to do that. Do we reduce load? When we have a clear week, it can be quite simple of, just creeping up the load a little bit and then reducing. But actually when you go Saturday, then away, we may stay on the road. So then that brings, where are we training, for example? And I think I touched on it there. When we were away in Washington, it was 95 degrees, but the humidity, before even stepping out for the warm-up, everybody was sweating. So that's going to influence the physical outputs there and some of the strategies that we may need to look at in preparation for that. So it brings a lot of challenges, some of which I must admit I hadn't considered, but have done a lot more research in those areas and how you can make it more comfortable for the player. But luckily we know our fixtures in advance, so we know when are we going to reduce load, or when are we traveling, or when do we intend to train when we get there? Do we intend to arrive late, train the next day, and how are we going to do that? So I think when we get towards those travel days, it becomes very technical and tactical, as I actually believe all sessions should be, because it's the physical side is really here to complement that. I hope that answers that.
Perfect. No, thank you. Thanks so much for that. And then the next one here is for again, kind of going with Utah being such, it's an interesting element to where you guys train. Is there any additional nutritional advice specifically for the high altitude and heat?
So hydration is going to be a key factor in that. We do know we see teams come here and often struggle with the altitude. I think, we know that ourselves, and we're traveling in and out of it all the time. So acclimatization is difficult. We're actually classed technically at not quite high enough to be moderate altitude. I think that's over 1,500 meters, and then high is something like 2,200 meters, but we're still reasonably high, and there is an effect. We tend to look at the players' hydration strategies because we've got heat here as well, which can, obviously that slide there gives us different questions that we need to answer. But a nutritionist will generally, I'm not aware of it as any having specific strategies. I think it depends on that individual and how they're actually responding to training in the altitude and heat.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And then just the last one for you here from Caroline is there research or considerations taken into the female game that maybe you guys or that you specifically use week to week, day to day, or things that you fall back on?
Yeah, I think that's a question that comes up a lot in the female game. I know back in 2017 at Celtic, we introduced a Fitter Women app to monitor that. I'm not sure that you can actually plan training on that. And that's not me talking about Fitter Women. I mean the menstrual cycle as well, because when you're working with 30 odd athletes, you'll end up pulling people out all the time. Having said that, I think you have to be cognizant of certain times in a cycle where training, there may be a different response. So you may look at subjective data and someone will be, say that they're feeling tired or they didn't respond that well to training. So I think it has to be in the back of your mind and collecting that data and analysing it. But I think it's a difficult area. I know there's been some relation to ACL injury. Again, that research is not clear cut within certain phases of the cycle. So I think it's good information to have, I'd be careful in how that's interpreted and what effect that has on training for the players. I think it's not going to be me going to the manager saying we're going to pull 10 players out today due to different areas of the cycle, but it's something that we have in the back of our mind, because sometimes questions may come up into an individual's response in training. We're able to look back on that and try and understand that a little bit more. I think there's going to be more research in that area and more studies in that area, but I actually wrote a couple of articles on that myself with Georgie Bruinvels, and I think it's a incredibly complex area to try and study.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for that, Andrew. And lastly, just want to really thank you for presenting today and spending some time talking on the things that that interest you, but are also relevant across our field and just sport in general. But yeah, again, thank you so much, and we appreciate you spending the time today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.